There is a bell, whose name no one remembers, that has echoed incessantly on Boston Harbor for over 100 years. It rang when the first Puritan ships arrived in 1630, carrying seeds and Bibles. It rang when fishing boats returned at dawn, their holds full of cod. It rang during the night tea was spilled into the bay. And it rings, for the last time in this story, when the ship named Queen of China left the harbor, heading straight toward the rising sun, carrying the ambitions of a nation less than a year old. Tonight, we will not follow kings or great battles. We will follow that bell. The rhythmic rise and fall of the tides on the small harbors of New England. For 150 years, from the first wooden houses to the moment America set foot in the East, let the rhythm of the waves carry you. Before there was a bell, there was only wind. In the summer of 1630, when a small fleet of 11 ships dropped anchor at what would later be called Massachusetts Bay, the first thing the people aboard heard was not a human voice, but the sound of waves against a shore none of them had ever set foot on. They were Puritans, believers who held that the Church of England needed to be purified of what they saw as the remnants of Catholicism. And they had crossed the Atlantic not to search for gold, but to build, in the words of one of their leaders, a city upon a hill, a model community the whole world would watch. Perhaps, on those first nights, with tents still unpitched and winter drawing near, none of them imagined that this rocky, broken ground, too barren for easy farming, too cold for a full growing season, would feed them not with soil, but with the sea. That was what set New England apart from the colonies to the south. In Virginia, rich soil fed tobacco, and tobacco fed vast plantations. But in Massachusetts, the stony, unyielding land forced people to turn their faces toward the water. Within a few years, small coastal towns, Boston, Salem, Marblehead, Gloucester, began to take shape not around fields, but around docks. Boston's first bell was hung sometime in the 1630s on a small public building near the harbor. It was not only for calling people to prayer. It rang when a ship returned, when a storm approached, when news arrived from a distant England. In a town where both spiritual life and economic life turned on the water, that bell became the shared heartbeat of the community. Picture an early morning in 1635. Mist still lies over the bay. The men have already gone out before dawn, in small boats, in search of cod, a fish that would become, quite literally, the currency of New England for more than a century. The cod was salted, dried, loaded onto ships, and carried across the Atlantic, to Catholic Europe, where eating fish on fast days was required, to the plantations of the West Indies, where cheap dried cod became the standard ration fed to thousands of enslaved people. From those very first years, the sea offered more than food. It offered a network, one that connected New England to distant lands, and through that network, both good things and dark things would pass through these small harbors alike. The bell rings once more. The morning begins. The tide rose that noon, and with it, the small fishing boats came home. Life in a Puritan port town in the mid-17th century ran on two parallel rhythms, the rhythm of the church and the rhythm of the tide, on the Sabbath, from sunset Saturday to sunset Sunday. All labor stopped, fishing included. But the other 6 days belonged to the sea. In Marblehead, one of the most important fishing towns, nearly every family had at least one man at sea. Small boats, usually crewed by 2 or 3 men, went out for days, sometimes weeks, all the way to the Grand Banks off Newfoundland, one of the richest fishing grounds in the world at the time. For the women who stayed behind, life must have been a string of days spent waiting, interwoven with work, tending a small plot of land, keeping livestock, managing the account books while husbands were away. Many of them becoming, in practice, the true operators of the household economy. Once caught, the cod was split, salted, and laid out to dry on wooden racks along the shore. A scene so characteristic that many New England towns still keep streets named Codfish Lane to this day. The lower grade cod, cracked, partly spoiled, was not thrown away. It was packed separately and sold cheaply to the plantations of the West Indies, where it became the standard ration for enslaved people forced to grow sugarcane. From very early on, the economy of these devout towns was bound, however indirectly, to slavery elsewhere. The church remained the center of everything. Sunday services ran for hours, split into two parts with a short meal in between. Ministers preached not only about faith, but returned again and again to the sea. The sea as a metaphor for life's dangers and its graces. When a ship failed to return on schedule, the whole town prayed. When it made it safely home through a storm, the church bell rang out in thanks. But behind that plain, devout exterior, the seeds of a far more complex commercial economy were already taking root. By the 1640s, Boston merchants had begun not just selling fish, but building ships to carry it, and then to carry anything at all that might turn a profit. New England pine, tall and straight, proved ideal for ship masts. So much so that the Royal Navy later ordered the finest pines marked with a broad arrow, forbidding colonists from cutting them, reserving them for British warships. One of the earliest seeds of resentment between colony and crown. By the mid-17th century, Boston had become one of the busiest ports in the entire British Empire, despite its still small population. On its docks, one could hear many tongues, English in every regional accent, Dutch from merchants arriving out of nearby New Amsterdam, and now and then Spanish or French from wandering sailors. Imagine standing on the Boston waterfront on an afternoon in 1650. The smell of salted fish mixes with pine tar from the nearby shipyards. The sound of hammers on wood, of ropes drawn taut, of carpenters calling to one another. In the distance, a newly built ship is being launched. Not an English ship, but one designed and built by New Englanders themselves from New England timber. In less than 30 years since the first Puritans set foot on this land, believing they would build a devout farming community, their children had become some of the finest shipbuilders and sailors in the entire empire. The tide goes out. The docks fall briefly quiet. But beneath that quiet, a trading network is spreading across the Atlantic. And it will soon bring back both prosperity and moral questions that the next generation will have to face. There is another kind of bell, one no one ever hung in a church tower. The bell of the ledger book, its pages turning by candlelight, recording every voyage out and every voyage home. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, New England merchants had built one of the most intricate trading networks of the age, what later historians would call the triangular trade. Molasses from the sugar plantations of the West Indies was shipped to New England. In distilleries in Boston, Newport, and Medford, that molasses was turned into rum. The rum, along with other goods, was carried to the coast of West Africa, where it was traded for human beings taken captive into slavery. Those people were then carried across the Atlantic under horrific conditions, the notorious Middle Passage, to the plantations of the West Indies or the southern colonies, where they were sold into forced labor. And the sugarcane they themselves planted and harvested became, once again, the molasses shipped back to New England, closing the circle. This must be said plainly, without flinching, the prosperity of many New England port towns, places later celebrated for their spirit of independence and liberty, was built in part on the foundations of slavery, even if most of that involvement was indirect, carried out through trade rather than through plantations on New England soil itself. Rhode Island, and Newport in particular, became one of the largest centers of the slave trade in British North America throughout the 18th century. This is not a footnote to the story. It is part of the very structure of the economy that built the prosperous harbors we are telling here. Not every merchant took part directly in the trafficking of human beings. Many dealt only in molasses, timber, and fish, and never sent a ship to Africa. But very few in that maritime economy stood entirely apart from the larger system that slavery powered. It is a truth that New England's towns, for generations, rarely told about themselves. Alongside that dark current ran other currents too. Lawful trade and smuggling, the two often difficult to tell apart in the 18th century. England's navigation acts required the colonies to trade certain goods only through English ports, on English ships. But the thousands of miles separating London from Boston made real enforcement almost impossible. By the mid-18th century, smuggling had become an ordinary, almost socially accepted part of commercial life in New England's ports. Many of the wealthiest merchant families, names that would later appear in the history of the Revolution, built part of their fortunes by quietly avoiding British duties. Picture a moonless night in Newport sometime in the 1750s. A small ship slips quietly up to a private wharf, not the official harbor. No great lanterns, no noise. Barrels of molasses are unloaded quickly, the invoices written up to say something other than what the cargo truly was. By morning, if a British customs inspector happens to check the books, everything appears perfectly in order. It was this half-legal way of life that shaped the character of New England's merchant class. Independent, self-assured, accustomed to deciding for themselves what was fair rather than waiting for instructions from across an ocean. When England, after the costly 7 Years' War, began tightening colonial taxation in the 1760s, it was precisely these seafaring merchants, people who had spent more than a century trading freely on their own terms, who would be among the first and the angriest to push back. The tide is turning, and with it, the mood of the harbors is beginning to change. On a small island offshore, where the land was too poor to grow much of anything, people learned instead to hunt the largest creatures in the ocean. Nantucket, a small sandy island roughly 30 miles off the Massachusetts coast, was first settled by people seeking religious quiet, many of them Quakers, whose beliefs differed from mainstream Puritanism and who were often treated as outsiders on the mainland. On this isolated island, they found an unexpected livelihood: whaling. At first, whaling was done close to shore. Whales that drifted in or swam near the beach were hunted from small boats. But by the early 18th century, Nantucketers had begun building larger ships, capable of sailing farther and staying at sea longer, sometimes for months, to hunt sperm whales in deep water. From the body of this whale, they drew the most valuable commodity in the pre-industrial economy of light: whale oil, used to light lamps across Europe and North America, and a special waxy substance called spermaceti, used to make candles that burned brighter and cleaner than any ordinary candle. The life of a Nantucket whaleman must have been one of the loneliest and harshest occupations of the age. Months adrift, crowded into cramped quarters, facing a creature that could grow longer than 30 meters and outweigh the small ship chasing it. Back home, meanwhile, the women of Nantucket, the wives, mothers, and sisters of men who were absent for most of the year, developed a degree of independence rarely seen among women in other colonial towns. They managed the family finances, ran shops, made business decisions, simply because their husbands were away for most of the marriage. By the mid-18th century, Nantucket, a tiny sand island that European maps had barely bothered to name a few decades earlier, had become one of the most important whaling centers in the world, competing with the fleets of both the Dutch and the English. Nantucket whale oil lit the streets of London. Its spermaceti candles burned in the finest homes of Europe. But this prosperity carried a cost that few at the time spoke of. Sperm whale populations near shore gradually dwindled, forcing the fleets to sail farther, stay out longer, and take on greater risk each year. An early sign of what centuries later would be called the overexploitation of marine resources. In New Bedford, another whaling port rising closer to the mainland, the mixing of cultures was just as striking. Whaling crews often included white sailors, free black sailors, and Native Americans alike. One of the most racially diverse working environments in America at the time, though that diversity did not mean equal treatment or equal opportunity for advancement. The bell on Nantucket was not the great church bell of Boston. It was smaller, plainer, fitting for a Quaker people who valued humility. But it marked the same rhythm all the same: waiting, hoping, and sometimes grief when a ship never came home. Some storms announced themselves with dark clouds on the horizon. Others announced themselves with printed notices nailed to a tavern door. After the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, a costly war that had won England control of most of North America from France. The British government faced an enormous debt. With a logic that seemed reasonable enough from London, it decided the colonies, which had benefited from the protection of British troops, ought to contribute more to the treasury. A series of new tax laws followed. The Sugar Act 1764, the Stamp Act 1765, and later, further duties on tea, paper, glass, and paint. For New England's seafaring merchants, people who, for more than a century, had grown used to deciding their own trade rules, even when that meant quietly bending British law. These acts were more than a financial burden. They were an insult to the very way of life these merchants had built across generations. Picture the mood inside a Boston harbor tavern late in 1765. Merchants, ship captains, and shipwrights sit around rough wooden tables, arguing over the Stamp Act, a law requiring every legal document, every newspaper, even every deck of playing cards, to carry a tax stamp purchased from the British government. For men who had spent their whole lives writing their own invoices and setting their own prices, having to pay for a stamp on every single sheet of paper felt like an intrusion they could not accept. New England's harbors quickly became centers of resistance. In Boston, groups like the Sons of Liberty organized protests, sometimes violent, against British tax officials. The tactic of boycott, refusing to buy British goods, spread widely. And who could enforce a boycott more effectively than the very merchants who controlled the docks? In 1770, tension boiled over into violence right on the Boston waterfront when British soldiers fired into a crowd, killing 5 people. An event later known as the Boston Massacre. 3 years later, on a December night in 1773, a group of men, some disguised as Mohawk warriors, boarded 3 British East India Company tea ships anchored in Boston Harbor and dumped more than 300 chests of tea into the water. A protest against the Tea Act, which had granted the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. Perhaps, as those chests of tea sank into the dark harbor water that night, some of the men involved thought of it simply as an act of commercial protest. None of them could have known for certain that this night would become one of the most remembered moments in the history of a nation that did not yet exist. England responded with the coercive acts, including the complete closure of Boston Harbor until the destroyed tea was paid for. This was a direct blow to the very rhythm of life we have followed for nearly 150 years. No ships in, no ships out, no fish, no molasses, no timber. The heartbeat of the city, the bell on the harbor, nearly stopped. But instead of submission, the closing of Boston's port united the other colonies in a way England had not anticipated. Food and supplies were sent from other colonies to support Boston's suffering residents. And within less than 2 years, the first shots of the Revolutionary War would ring out, not far from these very harbors, at Lexington and Concord. The bell no longer signals the hour of prayer or a ship coming home. Now, it signals something far larger and far less certain. Throughout the Revolutionary War, 1775, 1783, New England's harbors lived in a state of constant uncertainty. The Royal Navy, the most powerful naval force in the world at the time, blockaded many colonial ports, bringing lawful trade to a near standstill. Many merchants, ship captains, and sailors, people who had once made their living from cod, whale, oil, and molasses, now turned to a new trade, both legal and deeply dangerous: privateering. With official sanction from the revolutionary government, shipowners armed their merchant vessels and sailed out to attack and seize British cargo ships, selling off the goods, and the captured ship itself, for profit, a state-sanctioned form of economic warfare. It was a dangerous line of work. If captured, a crew might be treated as ordinary pirates, facing execution or imprisoned aboard Britain's notoriously brutal prison ships, where death from disease and starvation ran at horrifying rates. For many families in these small port towns, the war was not an abstract idea read about in a newspaper. It was a husband, a son, who never came home, not because he had fallen on a battlefield, but because he had gone missing at sea or died aboard some prison ship in New York Harbor. At the same time, Harbors that had once bustled now sat quiet for long stretches. No cod for export. No whale oil bound for London. No molasses coming in. Many wealthy merchant families lost most of their fortunes. Nantucket, an island almost entirely dependent on whaling, suffered especially. Its whaling fleet, built up over half a century, was nearly wiped out by the war, with many ships captured or destroyed by the British. But even in these hardest years, something deeper was shifting. These merchants, no longer bound by Britain's navigation acts, began to imagine possibilities that had previously been forbidden entirely. Trading directly, without any British middleman, with anyone in the world willing to do business. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, formally recognizing American independence, New England's harbors were free for the first time in their history. But they also faced a harsh reality. They no longer had access to the markets and protections of the British Empire that their ancestors had built an entire economy around for a century and a half. America was independent, but America was also, commercially, alone. The question facing the merchants standing on those empty docks in 1783 was simple and frightening. Where, now, could they find a new way to live? The answer, when it came, pointed toward a direction no American ship had ever dared attempt alone. Toward the rising sun, beyond the Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope, all the way to China, on February 22nd, 1784. Not by coincidence, George Washington's birthday. A ship named the Empress of China left the port of New York under the command of Captain John Green, with an investor and trade representative named Samuel Shaw aboard. The ship carried goods American merchants hoped the Chinese would want to buy. Wild ginseng gathered from the forests of the Appalachians, along with silver and a few other goods. Because, unlike Europe, Qing Dynasty China had little demand for what Western traders had to offer, and insisted on payment mostly in silver. It was an enormous gamble. No European nation believed the young United States, barely out of a war that had devastated its economy, was capable of completing a 15-month voyage to one of the most distant and, to Western eyes, mysterious empires in the world. Perhaps, as the ship slipped out of sight of land, even the most optimistic among the crew could not be certain whether they would be welcomed at Canton, the only port the King Court permitted foreign traders to enter, or turned away, or worse. But when the Empress of China arrived at Canton in August 1784, they were met with friendly curiosity. Chinese merchants, accustomed to dealing with the English, the Dutch, and the French, now encountered an entirely new flag. They referred to these Americans by a name that translates roughly as the New People, or, according to some records, simply identified them by an unfamiliar flag of stars and stripes. The ship sold off its ginseng and bought tea, porcelain, silk, and spices. Goods that, when the ship returned to New York in May 1785, brought back a profit large enough to send a shock through the entire New England merchant class. News spread quickly along the harbors, from New York to Boston, Salem, Providence. If a single ship could make this voyage and return with a profit, then this was the path New England's merchants, heirs to 150 years of shipbuilding, navigation, and risk-taking, had been searching for. Within a few years, ships from Salem, Massachusetts, a town far smaller than Boston, but no less ambitious, began making similar voyages, and by the early 19th century, Salem had become one of the wealthiest trading ports with the East in the entire country. So much so that locals often said that most of the goods America saw from Sumatra, China, and India passed through this small harbor first. The circle has closed. The first Puritans came to New England in 1630, hoping to build a devout farming community, only to be pushed toward the sea by barren, rocky ground. Their descendants learned to build ships, learned to fish, learned to trade, sometimes in ways they could take no pride in. And in the end, just 1 year after winning their independence, they reached all the way to the other side of the world. The bell on Boston Harbor is still there, even though the original has long since been replaced more than once. If you stood on a New England harbor today, Salem, Marblehead, Nantucket, New Bedford, Most of the shipyards, the fish drying racks, the molasses warehouses are gone. But if you close your eyes, perhaps you can still picture that rhythm. The tide rising and falling, a bell ringing to announce a ship's return, the sound of a hammer on new timber, and somewhere far off, a sail turning toward the horizon, carrying hope, ambition, and the moral weight that a young nation is still learning to face. The tide will rise again tomorrow. It always does. No matter which government rules, no matter which flag flies from the mast, sleep well.